Hello there, and welcome to this bite-sized introduction to private client law. Whether you are a student studying law and applying for pupillage, or you haven't yet embarked upon any legal studies, we hope that this will give you a little bit of insight into one of the types of work we do here at Radcliffe Chambers. My name's Kate Selway. I'm a Queen's Counsel, and I've been practicing at the bar for about 25 years. I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Sophia Rogers, who's been in practice, I think, about 7 or so years. Is that right, Sophia?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, so when we say private client law, what do we actually mean? Well, it's an umbrella term, I think, that covers a range of work that we do for mainly private individuals and families. And it covers a broad range of work, ranging from issues about wills, trusts, probate after people die, estate management, taxation, and wealth planning. We might simply be giving advice to our clients, or we might be involved in disputes. And our clients are having disputes with others, which means that we end up representing them in court. And Sophia and I thought that rather than just give you a long explanation about all that, if we ask each other questions, it will become, we hope, easier to explain by giving you some examples of the sorts of things we do. So, Sophia, let me start by asking you how you got into this area of law and why you like it.
So, I think it's quite typical for a junior tenant when you first start practice. You do a broad range of different chancery practice areas. So I was fortunate enough to do insolvency, commercial work, property work, and private client, but I just really enjoyed the private client stuff. So I've chosen to specialise in that.
And why is that? Why do you enjoy the private client work?
I think because private client, I think more than probably any other practice area, is a really nice split between technical law, particularly with trust cases and tax, where tax becomes involved, but also the human and personal side. So you get to learn personal stories about people. It's basically the practice area for the nosy barrister who also likes the technical side of law. Yeah. What about you? I mean, how varied is the work you do and your private client cases?
Yeah, I say it's pretty varied, really. Even when the subject matter is similar, I agree with you. It's the people you become involved with, and they're always different. There's always a new twist, meaning no two cases are ever the same. So, I mean, even within the same subject matter, if you're dealing with a will dispute, I think there's an infinite variety of human nature at work, and so no two cases ever really feel the same. I think in terms of variation, I suppose I could say broadly, the main types of work in my private client work would be will disputes. So that might be because there's a dispute after someone dies about whether, for example, they had capacity to make a will. Obviously, you'll know, Sophia, we do a lot of that in chambers. Or perhaps the language of the will is confusing or legally unclear, and there can often be will disputes about the meaning of a will. Another type of work I do is giving tax advice to clients who want to make sure their estates aren't going to be subject to too much inheritance tax after their death. And perhaps a third type of case is in relation to trusts. Where, for example, there has been criticism of a trustee of a trust fund. Maybe they've run off with the money, maybe they haven't invested it properly, and the beneficiaries want to complain about that, or they want to remove the trustee. So, I mean, we do different sorts of cases as well, but I suppose those would be the three main areas of variety. What about you? What are you working on at the moment?
So my practice is very, very similar. I think at the moment, the trend I've seen is quite a lot of probate claims, which is where people, like you say, are disputing the validity of wills. I've got quite a fun ongoing one at the moment where my client's case is that the will was forged by a known fraudster. And it only appeared about 10 years after the deceased died. And there's lots of interesting evidence given by different witnesses about who say they were there when the will was signed, or give evidence as to whether the deceased would have made a will or not. And it's a case where we've got experts involved, so handwriting experts giving a view as to at what time over that 10-year period or later they think the will was executed. So that's a really fun one.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I know we've both done a fair few of those. Let me tell you about one of my present cases. I've got still on the probate dispute line. I've got a case involving an American lady who died. She had a degenerative disease. It wasn't Alzheimer's, but it was something not too dissimilar. And she left a whole host of wills, and we're not sure which of them is valid. She made wills in the United Kingdom, she made wills in Louisiana, and she also made wills in California. And she had property in all three of those jurisdictions, as well as other property around the world. There's already some litigation going on overseas in the States about whether she had capacity to make a will. And that raises some really interesting questions about the laws of foreign jurisdictions and the extent to which those foreign decisions are either relevant, and if so, whether they're binding over here in England. So that's ongoing. So I better not say too many of the juicy details of that one, but it raises an interesting cross-border. Some of our cases, as you know, have a cross-border element where we need to become familiar with the law of other jurisdictions. Let me change the subject now. How much of your time do you spend in court? That's a question that we're often asked, I know. And I think it inevitably varies depending how senior you are in chambers. But how much of your time do you spend in court, Sophia?
Probably on average around 50-50. Although during the pandemic, I've seen less court time, I think because there was such a backlog in the courts while they were trying to work out remote hearings that it just took a while to get things heard. But when I started out, I spent a lot more time in court doing smaller types of hearings. But I think you're right, as you become more senior, the types of cases you do and the type of work's a bit meatier. So you'll do fewer hearings, but the ones you do have are more substantive. Yeah.
And did you, when you were really junior, I can't remember, it's so long ago for me, did you have much private client work in court, or was it other types of work? As you said at the beginning, obviously when you are a very junior tenant, you have to do all sorts.
Yeah, so a lot of my court time was things like insolvency and bankruptcy, short hearings, possession hearings. And certainly when I was a junior barrister, you travel around quite a lot to all the different county courts outside of London to turn up and do those types of hearings, which were listed for quite short periods of time. But I kind of graduated out of that type of work now. And yeah, I think now I tend to get involved in a case at the beginning and advise on it, and then throughout. And then the hearings we have, there might be a couple of shorter procedural hearings, but it's usually kind of more substantive stuff that I'd go to court over now.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember, I suppose our audience, if they're students and just applying for pupillage, they'll be interested in knowing how long it takes to get your first sort of juicy probate case. I mean, I certainly don't remember looking back in my very junior years, getting a sort of juicy witness action, for a good few years, I think. I'm certainly not in the first 2 or 3 years.
I think I definitely had 75 Act claims, which are inheritance disputes, where people are arguing over whether someone should be made provision from an estate. But I think the problem with those types of claims, well, probate claims in general, from an advocate's perspective, is they settle. So I think I was instructed on quite a lot of them, and I attended quite a lot of mediations, which were then successful. So I didn't have that many trials. It's been more recently that I've done more stuff in court.
Still, I mean, I know from experience, I don't know whether your view is the same, if you're involved in a mediation, that can sometimes be more grueling than spending a day in court, can't it?
Yes, yeah, well, it's a whole day, isn't it? And it can go on well beyond the court hours as well, into the evening, can't it?
They can indeed.
As everyone's trying to negotiate the settlement and then prepare it and draw it up and agree all the terms to it. So yeah,
I don't know about your I think the longest mediation I was at, in fact, it ended successfully. It was a trust dispute, surprisingly enough. I was for some professional trustees, but I guess it took us a long time to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. I think we eventually came out near about midnight. It was certainly the longest one. They're not usually quite
no,
that bad.
They're not usually as long as that, but or at least you reached settlement. It would have been disappointing to have spent so long and then not.
It would.
Then not reach settlement.
It would have done.
What about you? Do you do what's your split? Do you do a lot of advisory work, or what's your court time like?
Yeah, it's difficult to sort of split it up. I would say mostly litigation. Most of the work I do is either directly being in court or being involved in a dispute of some nature or other that will either settle or end up in court or perhaps mediate. So it's mostly litigation, but I do quite a bit of purely advisory work. And when I do that, it's usually either estate planning advice to individuals to help them mitigate their tax liabilities or those of their estates, or to help them draft wills or trusts, or to advise on the taxation of trusts. Sometimes people want to bring trusts to an end. So if you've got a settlement that's been made, for example, let's say for the benefit of grandchildren, and those grandchildren are going to take the trust assets at 25, does the trust have to end at 25? Can it be extended? If it can be extended, what are the tax implications? So that sort of advice. And in fact, very occasionally, I even advise, I don't know if you've ever done any Settled Land Act work, but Settled Land Act trustees, these are, as you know, an old type of settlement which can't be created anymore, but that's very interesting work. Doesn't come along that often at the moment.
No, I think I've only seen one or two.
Yeah. I don't even think, for our students listening, I don't even think they teach settled land anymore. No. Is that right?
Yeah, I certainly wasn't taught it when I was young.
Well.
So.
What about in terms of, I mentioned sort of cross-border work earlier on, Sophia. Have you had much opportunity to do any international work?
Yes, I've been fortunate to have been able to go on a few different secondments. In the trust world, we often call it offshore work, don't we? In offshore jurisdictions, I've had secondments in Jersey, Guernsey, and most recently in the Cayman Islands, which I really enjoyed. Not just for the work, it was a very nice place to go for a few months. I've also had some involvement in some other offshore cases in other jurisdictions. So yeah, I think that's a nice thing about private client work, isn't it? That I at least find it really interesting, seeing what's going on in other legal systems and how the law might vary to ours. And yeah. And so do you think, well, something I've been wondering recently is whether there are particular trends at the moment. I know a few years ago, I think there was a bit of a trend that we were seeing a lot of Inheritance Act claims coming through, whereas I think it's evened out a little bit now and there's more probates.
Yeah, I think, just sort of looking back over the years, I think what will always happen from time to time, you can never quite predict what area it's going to be in next, but if there's a particularly important case been reported, the inheritance dispute you mentioned, one can think of the last few years, Eilert and Mitson Blue Cross case, where an adult child, as we call them, was asking for provision from an estate, and I think that encouraged lots of claims of similar types to be brought. I think a few years before that, there was a whole raft of beneficial interest cases, by which we mean where cohabiting couples have split up and haven't quite sorted out who was going to have the house, and it's all based on not proper agreements, but a sort of general understanding. We saw a lot of those sorts of cases, didn't we? I think sometimes change comes, or trends come, because of changes in tax advice. So sometimes a particular tax scheme will either be flavour of the moment, or everybody will be running to try and do something different. So changes in legislation, I think, can fuel trends. Even economic changes, unsurprisingly. So if house prices increase, the value of people's estates go up, and they're therefore concerned to know whether they're going to be subject to inheritance tax when they die, and then what they can do about that. I think during the early days of the COVID pandemic, the rules about witnessing wills were altered slightly. I don't know about you, but I haven't yet been able to tell whether that's going to lead to increased disputes about valid will making or not. But I suppose that's a sort of watch this space, isn't it?
Yeah, I've seen a few claims come through where quite hurried wills have been done for people that have been ill with COVID, but only a couple so far. But that could end up being a trend, couldn't it?
It could, yeah. I think we need to watch out for that one. Good. That leads neatly on to our last couple of questions. How, Sophia, has the type of work you do developed since you first started in practice?
So as I was saying, it's developed more towards private client work because that's something that I've really wanted to specialise in. And the types of cases, as I say, have gotten a bit kind of chunkier, a little bit more complex as well in terms of obviously higher value, but also I think the claims that I do now seem to span a lot more evidence. There's a lot more kind of moving parts or components to the cases that I do now to what I did when I first started out in practice. Yeah. What about you? I mean, Kate, you have just taken Silk, which is very exciting. How has that changed your practice? Has it changed the type of work you do, or what did it feel like?
Well, obviously it felt amazing, although it was just a week before lockdown. I took Silk in March 2020. So a week later, Boris said we all needed to stay at home. So that wasn't, that meant I had a lot of trials in the diary. I had a tax case, I had a probate dispute. And at that stage, because it was all so sudden, nobody really knew how to cope with transitioning immediately into online hearings. So I had some cases that were adjourned, that were heard later in the year as remote hearings. I think there's probably no massive overnight transition because, of course, as is typical of our work, we're involved in longer cases that take time to come to court. Generally speaking, however, when you take Silk, you would expect gradually to be instructed on bigger, longer cases. You might be brought in on cases by juniors, either in your chambers or perhaps elsewhere, depending on the sort of work you do. So you might not start a case from the very beginning, but you might be brought in, at a middle phase of that case before it actually gets to court. Sometimes as well, you're in terms of advisory work, Silks are often looked at for second opinions, either because someone is worried about a particular thing and just wants to make double sure that the advice they've got, perhaps they need a QC's name at the bottom of it. So as I said, no overnight change, but gradually you'd be hoping to take on the bigger, longer litigation type case.
So have you, because people watching might not know, but Silk gets a slightly different outfit in court to everyone else. Have you been able to wear your Silk outfit? I call it an outfit. Have you had the chance to wear your Silk outfit yet in live in-person court?
Not in person. I know. I've got this lovely silk gown. It's behind me somewhere. Somewhere in my room. But no, all my trials, even a 2-week trial I had earlier this year, was done on Microsoft Teams. So I have yet to wear my lovely, I suppose I could have worn it in my room whilst I was doing my remote trial, but I think I might have, I think the silk gown might have got caught up in my chair. So no. On that note, I think we've probably exhausted our audience's patience. That's all we have time for. So we hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.